Well, for more on how the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, is seen on the continent and how the U.S. election is being perceived, Paul spoke with Ramah Nyang from Global Business Africa.
If you go all the way back to, say, 2001 to date, the bulk of trade, actually, about 90% of it has been in commodities, specifically oil. Of course, with the rise of U.S. domestic shale production, that's tapered off quite a bit, much to the detriment of producers like Nigeria, who used to actually push a lot of their crude into the U.S. market. But the flip side of it is this. If you look at countries like Kenya, for example, they have built up entire apparel industries specifically to serve the American market. So from the perspective of individuals who set up businesses specifically to deal with American textile companies, it has been a significant benefit. Can more be done? Absolutely. The extension that was done earlier in the year, of course, for AGOA, pushing it all the way to 2025 was extremely vital, but there's still a lot more tweaks to that particular trade deal that do need to be done.
Many experts here have been voicing concern in recent years that the US has been losing ground to China in terms of trade and development. How fair is that? Do African business leaders now take China more seriously than the US?
Not necessarily, but there's also a bit of a framing problem, shall we say, with the way that whole US-China rivalry thing is often framed. It's not a case of either or, because in most cases, for example, if you're flying out of Kenya on Kenya Airways, you'll probably be flying on an American-made plane. Boeing fleets are pretty much the norm around here. SAA, Ethiopian, even Kenya Airways, all the major carriers, for example, do use American products. But on the flip side of it, they're places where the American companies do have strengths and the Chinese ones simply do not. Not everyone, for example, across sub-Saharan Africa will walk into a dealer and immediately splurge on an iPhone. It's simply too pricey. But at the same time, if you look at where the Chinese companies have come in, especially on the mobile phone space, a lot of their producers have concentrated on that low end of the market, providing affordable, accessible smartphones. And that's really a fine demonstration of exactly where these two countries and the industries based in each one come into their own. So it's more of a complementary relationship, shall we say, at least on the business side. On the government side, however, that's a completely different story. A lot of governments will argue that, look, we prefer dealing with the Chinese when it comes to financing, partly because they bring in aid and they don't come in with conditions attached to exactly how that money should be spent, where it should be spent, and so on and so forth. And that's not necessarily 100% true, because if you do take debt out from China, usually that comes in with a caveat that, look, this has to go to a Chinese contractor. So on one hand, yes, there is the rivalry tends to be framed that way, but the facts on the ground usually paint a far more nuanced picture.
So the man about to vacate the White House, Barack Obama, the first US president of African-American heritage, his father, of course, Kenyan. What's the perception of Barack Obama across Africa? Is he seen as having done enough for the continent?
Not necessarily. It's a bit of a mixed picture. On one hand, yes, there's a whole AGOA extension thing going on, which for a lot of business leaders is a big plus. But there was always an element of realism when Mr. Obama, of course, ascended to the White House, to the extent that, look, just because he happened to have a Kenyan father doesn't necessarily mean that American policy will now suddenly be skewed in favor of African countries. That was simply not going to happen. However, the focus, of course, in the interim, over his 2 terms in office, has also been very specifically on a bunch of other things. So yes, we've got the Power Africa program, which is currently running, trying to increase electricity access right across the African continent. There's a trade issues with AGOA, but there's also been a very strong emphasis on security issues. Under Mr. Obama, we've seen an expansion, for example, of American operations, military operations of that, right across the continent. So now you've got drone bases, for example, that have been expanded in Western Africa as well, in countries as different as, say, Cameroon, which previously would never have actually been hosting any American bases, much less UAV bases for that matter. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but on the whole, Mr. Obama's record here is, yes, he's popular, but at the end of the day, he's an American president serving American taxpayers. Africa really doesn't come into the picture.
Let's look at the candidates in this election then. Hillary Clinton, of course, her husband was seen as prioritizing many African causes during his presidency. Is Hillary Clinton seen as a candidate who would essentially extend Obama's policies towards Africa?
Not necessarily, and this goes back to the whole idea that Africa, especially in this election, really hasn't come up that high up in the agenda. And even on trade terms, it really wouldn't. I mean, US-Africa trade accounts for about 2% of the entire United States trade with the rest of the planet. So if you use that as an indicator, Africa really would not merit the sort of attention, perhaps, that some would accord it to. But on some respects, there's some policies that have been advocated by Hillary Rodham Clinton that would be of interest to individuals on this side of the continent. For example, her stance on immigration, for instance, because we've got quite a few students who actually do go to the United States for either undergraduate education or even graduate education, people who travel there to do business, people who emigrate, of course, to the United States. So to the extent that she has a slightly more open borders, and I'm using that in quote, open borders approach to immigration, yes, she is seen a lot more favorably. But as far as AGOA is concerned, neither of these two candidates have actually explicitly come out and said, this is what we'd like to actually do with respect to AGOA. Are we going to tweak it? No one simply knows at this particular point.
Finally, Donald Trump, if he's elected, potentially a more anti-free trade president, which could affect certain African countries. Also, some of the things he's been saying recently about this election here being potentially rigged, that's the kind of language we're used to hearing from strongmen presidents in other parts of the world, including some African countries. I wonder, how is Donald Trump perceived across Africa?
I guess the best way of summarizing it was just to refer you to what Trevor Noah did, this excellent sketch piece about how Donald Trump would be the perfect African dictator. And I know it's a bit stereotypical, but it does sum up to a large extent the perception of Donald Trump in many an African country. And especially that part when he pivots over to how he's going to actually make America great again, with a very strong emphasis on trade protectionism, reciprocal, very aggressive tariff lines being put in place. That, if you're an economic policymaker in Africa, can be a bit scary, because there's some here who will ask, okay, if President Trump shows up in the White House in 2017, what happens to AGOA, for example? And one example of what might actually go wrong, for example, is what happened with respect to South Africa. One of the main sticking points when AGOA was renegotiated and extended, of course, all the way to 2025, was the fact that American politicians made a very strong pitch and said, look, South Africa does need to open up its market to US chicken imports. Fast forwards to November, where we are right now, you've got South African chicken farmers who are saying, look, we might actually lose about 12,000 jobs just because of the 65,000 tons of American chicken that we've agreed to let into our market. So perhaps, that's just one example, but perhaps if we do end up with President Trump, trade clashes of that sort might actually become the norm rather than the exception.